Hey guys, welcome back. Okay, I've recorded this a couple times and can't seem to get it under 25 minutes. So let's fingers crossed that third time's the charm. All right, couple questions for review. First question, what was the primary reason the European explorers crossed the Atlantic to the west? Why did they set out by sea? And hopefully you put to find a more direct route to Asia for silks and spices. So just remember, they had the land route. The Muslims took the land route away when they conquered Constantinople and rechanged into Istanbul. So Europeans got to find another way to get to Asia. Second question, what's the first European country to try to find a water route to Asia? And hopefully you chose Portugal, because that is the correct answer. They're led by this guy right here, Henry the Navigator. Okay, I'm going to be skipping some stuff, some videos, so don't ignore those. All right, so in 1519, Ferdinand Magellan, who is sponsored by Spain, he's actually Portuguese, but Portugal's like, we've already found a route, we're fine. He's sponsored by Spain, and so he sets out with 5 ships to find a path from through North and South America. And his ships eventually make it to the southern tip of South America. They navigate through, which is now known as the Strait of Magellan, and they end up on the other side in the Pacific. Well, his crew's really excited and they've done their mission, so they think they're going to turn around and go home. And Magellan says, nope, not going to do it. We're going to keep going. Magellan, no one had ever crossed the Pacific this way, or hadn't been crossed at all, right? The Europeans. And so Magellan thinks, oh, it'll only be like 3 weeks. It'll be fine, guys. We can do it in 3 weeks. We've got provisions. Well, that 3 weeks turned into 4 months. 4 months until he reached the Philippines. All right, there's lots of storms going on. They lose a lot of people, lose a lot of ships once they get there. But in the end, he gets to the Spice Islands. He gets to the Philippines, right? But during that 4-month voyage, it was really bad. The crew was forced to eat like biscuit powder, basically like crumbs mixed with like rat feces, and they eventually ate rats. They didn't have any fresh water. They had oxide, which they used like the seawater to soften, but there are a lot of people were dying here, lots of malnutrition. Eventually, Magellan again makes it to the Philippines, and it's like, great, we're here, let's trade. And so he was talking to some local chiefs. Well, what do you know? He gets involved in a skirmish between these local chiefs, and he survived all of that after his putting down all these mutinies by his soldiers, only to die by a poison arrow in the Philippines. Magellan's crew continues on, but only one ship makes it. One ship and 18 men make it back to Spain 3 years after their voyage had started. So 1519 is when they started. They make it back in 1522. And when the people thought they were gone, they were lost. And so the ships shows up and the Spanish celebrate, and the Spanish hail them as the first people to circumnavigate or sail around the world. So while Magellan himself didn't make it back, his crew did. He is credited with that. And what do you know? Now we effectively is kind of proven that the world is round. Ignore this video.
Ferdinand Magellan.
There we go. Okay. Let's talk about what happens in Mexico. So you guys watch videos over this, not so much on what happens in Peru with the Incas, but you did over what happens with the Aztecs. So I'm going to go pretty quickly on this. But in 1519, Spain has a lot going on. So Magellan's out there trying to circumnavigate, and we have conquistadors, these Spanish conquerors going in, and they're going to try to dominate South America and North America. And they're pretty successful at doing so. Hernan Cortez in 1519 makes his way to Mexico and hears all about gold and silver and this amazing Aztec empire. Well, Cortez searches and searches and searches, and eventually he gets to the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. The Aztec Emperor Montezuma, as you watch in the Mankind video, welcomes Cortez and his men in. They think they're gods at first, wearing armor. He shows Cortez the empire's gold supply, and Cortez is not satisfied. He wants all of it. He wants them gone. There ends up being a skirmish. So Cortez has to leave. And he, when he gets back, he's realized that some of the men he left behind actually end up killing some warriors, some chiefs, and some religious leaders. So there's like a big uprising. So when Cortez gets back to Tenochtitlan, he's met with a lot of hostility that already was there. But now you have the Aztecs kind of pushing out these Spanish intruders. Now we do know that Cortez goes to Montezuma. It's like, I'm going to kill you if you don't get these people out of here, right? Because he's about to escape. And Montezuma goes out to the crowd and says, like, these are my friends. And the crowd's like, whatever, they just killed a bunch of our people. And that's when we know they kill Montezuma the second. However, all of that to the side, Cortez ends up conquering the massive empire in 1521. And there are a few reasons for that. One, they do have advanced weapons, okay? The gun is stronger than the arrow, okay? Additionally, if you remember back to the mankind video, then you know that the Aztecs were very much into human sacrifices. And so they would conquer other local tribes and then sacrifice them as part of their religious ceremonies. Well, these local tribes that weren't Aztec did not like that. They were like, we're tired of seeing our people get killed. It's whatever. So they teamed up with the Spanish to help them. But the most important, put a star by this, okay? The most important weapon that Spain had, or the thing they had in their back pocket, was disease. And they didn't even know, Cortez, that he was not, they didn't set out thinking, hey, I got this disease, I'm going to give it to you and kill everybody. It just happened that way. All right, so diseases like measles, mumps, smallpox, typhus, those are diseases Europeans are bringing into the Americas, and there's no immunity built up at all for these diseases. And so they wipe out hundreds of thousands of people. Smallpox and measles are kind of the big culprits there. Over time, you're going to have the disease itself killing millions of natives in central Mexico. So that's really what kind of helped Cortez conquer the Aztec Empire. It was sheer luck for Cortez with the way diseases spread. We're going to see this video. Alrighty, let's talk Francisco Pizarro. So Pizarro wants to take over the Incan Empire. And in 1532, he's a conquistador. Remember, these are the Spanish name for conquerors. He marches a small force into South America and he conquers the Incan Empire. Pizarro had about 200 men when he met the Incan ruler. And Atahualpa actually commanded troops of about 30,000, but when he came to meet Pizarro, he only brought a couple thousand and he wasn't armed. Well, what do you know? The Spaniards wait and are waiting or they're hiding, and then they ambush the Incan forces and kidnap Atahualpa. Atahualpa offers in exchange for his freedom like rooms of gold and silver, and the Spanish are like, we don't want just one room. No. So they kill him because they want to take everything. The Aztec remaining Incan troops retreat all the way back to the Incan capital of Cusco, and Pizarro is able to march on into Cusco and very easily capture the Incas without a struggle in 1532. And what do you know? The same thing, diseases helped, all that good stuff. Right. So what did this empire look like in Spain, or how was this structure set up by Spanish colonies or colonists in the Americas? As you can see here, it's really more of a pyramid, just like any kind of social hierarchy structure. At the top are peninsulares, who are the Spanish settlers. Beneath them are Spanish born blood, but they're born in the Americas. So like, say a Spanish man and woman were married, came to the colonies, established some control here, and they had a child, but the child was born in like the Americas. They were technically below them and they were called Creoles. And then you had mixed population. So a majority of the settlers, the peninsulares, were men. Well, what do you know? The men are like, hey, there's a native woman, I want her. And so you have this you end up having relations between the native women and the peninsulares. So some of these relationships were welcomed, many were not. Doesn't matter though, because now you have a mixed child between these two different groups of people. And so you have mestizos, which are mixed Spanish and Native American. And then you have, well, later on, once the Europeans start bringing in slaves from Africa, you have mulattoes, which is a mix of Spanish and African blood. So you will have them as a higher structure. And at the bottom are just slaves in general. All right. The system that was set up was called the encomienda, and it would usually had a ruler, like a Spanish ruler, and part of the responsibility of the Spanish, like landlord, we're going to call them, over this encomienda was to treat the slaves fairly, and that was part of the agreement, right? So Spain gave permission to people to become landlords and become these rulers over the encomiendas. And that didn't exactly happen. So, for example, the holders of the encomiendas promised Spanish rulers that they would act fairly and respect the workers. But instead, you saw a lot of abuse of natives, and many were worked to death, especially in dangerous mines. When Columbus first got to the Americas and again, he doesn't realize it, but when he first gets there, he leaves behind a small little group of people and says, we're going to come back for you, but you need to establish let's establish a pattern here, and we really need to find gold and silver. So that's your number one job. And when Columbus comes back, he's actually kind of shocked at what he finds. So we are going to watch this little video over that.
The Second Fleet left in September 1493 with huge expectations. Columbus was anxious to return to Hispaniola to see whether the little colony he'd left behind had resulted in a windfall of gold and spices. But what he found was that the colony had become a killing field.
There was increasing friction over the Spaniards wanting food, over their treatment of the women, over their demands for gold, and finally they were all killed, probably massacred by the infuriated indigenous people. And that unfortunately sets the tone for all the later interaction between the Spaniards and the indigenous inhabitants of the West Indies.
From this point on, the Indians became little more than slaves. Every Indian over 14 years old was forced to mine for gold.
They're taken from their total freedom, and they're forced to get gold, which is a meaningless substance for them, out of the ground to give to these people, and they're forced and they're beaten and they're exploited. The Indians simply, when they were caught up in this, they lost the will to live. They could not picture the world that the Spanish imagined.
But it's a world Columbus had imagined from the start.
The first day he encounters the Indians, he talks about what beautiful bills they are and what good slaves they're going to make. He takes Indians who come to him to trade and he captures them and he keeps them.
Columbus was a man of his times. Columbus, like the settlers, was there to make money. He was not too particular about the ways that he chose to make money, because that's the way people behaved. There was a flourishing slave trade in Europe in the Middle Ages. Slavery was a customary part of European society. It didn't seem in any way unnatural for Columbus or the other settlers to do this.
One of the chiefs has a vision when he takes this drug cohobe, in which he sees that a clothed people will come and destroy the Indians, and that after he dies, his people won't live long, that they will die in starvation and in slavery.
Columbus gets back and he's kind of devastated by what he sees, but and as the video says, Columbus is a man of his time. So it's not that he was devastated that people were being treated this way. He was devastated that people were being treated this way because it would lead to their death. And death wasn't what they wanted, right? Because dead natives are no good to a working population. So that was kind of more of his focus and his concern. All right, we're going to shift gears here and focus on North America now and Northern European. So if you remember back to the first lecture, we did talk about the Treaty of Tordesillas, which divided up land between Spain and Portugal, but other countries don't care about this treaty, especially those countries that are not predominantly Catholic. So for example, like French, English, and Dutch are all going to establish colonies in North America. We're really only going to talk about the French and the English right now. And these colonies all come, explorer after explorer, looking for this legendary, mythological, which means it's not real, Northwest Passage. This is a non-existent, it does not exist, waterway through North America. The thought by these explorers was that if they could find this passageway, which again does not exist, it would be a highly profitable trade route to Asia because it would cut out a lot of that travel time. Again, this does not exist, and it was never found because it does not exist. So instead, people are establishing colonies, right? In 1534, you have Jacques Cartier reaches a gulf in the eastern coast of Canada that leads him to the St. Lawrence River, and he travels downward. He also founds Montreal in Canada. Later on, you have Samuel de Champlain come in 1608. He sails up the St. Lawrence River and founds the city of Quebec, which will become France's colonial empire in North America. It's known as New France. New France itself is actually not very populated. It only has about 64,000 people. And what do you know? Fayetteville's a lot larger than that. Eventually, we do have French sailors make their way all the way down the Mississippi into what we now know as Louisiana. It's named after the French King Louis XIV. We're going to talk about him next. By the early 1700s, New France covers most of Midwestern United States and Eastern Canada. While France's, again, their empire is very vast but not very populated, a large portion of the colonists that come from France are just young men. They have no desire to settle here, no desire to start families. They just want to make money. And they're making money by killing beavers and taking the beaver skin back to France. The beaver fur trade was highly profitable, mostly beavers, but other furs as well. But yes, very profitable. They're just making money off the land. Whereas when we look at England and what England wants to do, it's different right away. So England wants to establish colonies. All right. They are inspired by the Spanish and French. And in 1606, you have your first one that sets out. In late 1606, you have 3 ships and 100 settlers leave the English harbor. They arrive in early 1607, reaching the coast of Virginia. And the colonists claim the land as their own, and they name it Jamestown in honor of King James of England. We know that in Jamestown, the colony start as disastrous. The settlers are more focused on gold than growing crops and survival. During the first few years, 7 out of every 10 people die of hunger, disease, or battle with Native Americans. Eventually, they're going to find tobacco, and that will be a big cash crop, and that's what's really going to help them become a permanent settlement for the English colonies and for England as a country. They dominate the tobacco trade. In 1620, the Puritans and the Pilgrims will come over. So a group known as Pilgrims will found the second English colony, Plymouth in Massachusetts. They are persecuted by their religious beliefs in England. And about 10 years later, you have the Puritans who also will come over and seek religious freedom from England's Anglican Church. And they establish a colony close by at Massachusetts Bay. Pilgrims and Puritans both wanted to build a model Christian community and follow the examples that were set forth. I mean, don't forget that you do have that big split. And so like Luther and Calvin, how strict their upbringings were, that was a lot of what Puritans and Pilgrims were following. And so, again, that's one of the reasons why North America is not a predominantly Catholic religion, or the United States is not a predominantly Catholic area, because those are the people that founded us. France, predominantly Catholic. Mexico or Latin America, basically Mexico down, is predominantly Catholic because that's who settled and who influenced their population. So again, all of these things connect and come back together. Okay. The Puritans, we know they become successful. All right. They get help from the native populations, and there we go. Here and now we're off. All right. So we've started to establish colonies. We're killing off the native population from disease. Now we got to replace them somehow. So Europe turns to another people that they view as beneath them, and that's going to be Africa. So the next set of notes you're going to do, we'll talk more about the Africa slave trade, triangular trade, Columbian exchange, and we'll wrap it up with diseases and kind of the rise of capitalism. Let me know what questions you guys have.